Greetings, friends. Today we will have a story about the triumph and tragedy associated with Mount Nanga Parbat. The climber Tomasz Makiewicz was born in 1975 in Dzialicin, Poland. For the first 10 years, he and his sister lived with their grandmother in this small town on the banks of the Warta River. It was there that his love of wildlife was born. When Tomasz turned 10, his family moved to a larger city, which was a real disaster for him. He greatly missed the countryside and wildlife, which greatly affected his adolescence, which was in the 90s. As a teenager, Tomasz started breathing glue and then moved on to harder drugs. He left home and started living on the streets. His sister Agnieszka found him and took him to a rehabilitation center. But 3 months later, he was back on the street and went back to using drugs. Before I continue, I would like to ask you to subscribe to the channel. For you, it is just a few clicks, but for me, it makes a big difference and helps in the development of the channel. Now, let's continue. When Tomasz turned 18, he settled in a rehabilitation center where they practiced occupational therapy. For 2 years, he dug ditches, worked as a loader, and did construction work. Eventually, he managed to get rid of his drug addiction. After moving to Warsaw, he met a girl named Joanna, whom he eventually married. Life began to get better, but as his friends say, Tomasz could not get rid of the feeling of emptiness and lack of purpose. He took on a variety of endeavors to fill the inner emptiness. First, he enrolled at the University of Warsaw to study philosophy, but after a few months he dropped out and decided to hitchhike to India, where he spent a year. It was there that Tomasz saw the Himalayas for the first time and decided to take up high-altitude mountaineering. Tomasz and Joanna moved to Ireland, where she got a job as a child psychologist and Tomasz worked as a mechanic. One day in 2008, he met Marek Klonowski, a fellow countryman and mountaineer. Marek recalls their first meeting at a party in Ireland. I was talking about how I had tried to climb Mt. Logan in Canada alone, and Tomasz suddenly said that next time he would go there with me. He enthusiastically started climbing the local rocks of Ireland and quickly mastered the art without attending any climbing courses or schools. He had obvious talent. Makiewicz kept his promise. In May 2008, the two Poles traveled to Canada to climb the mountain together and then raft down to the ocean, which they successfully accomplished. They received the Collis Award for this 40-day expedition. In 2009, Tomasz had already successfully stormed Khan Tengri, a 7,010-meter high mountain, alone. After that, his attention was drawn to Mount Nanga Parbat, one of the highest mountains on the planet, the 9th highest. Mount Nanga Parbat is considered one of the most difficult 8,000ers to climb. But for some reason, Tomasz fell in love with this particular peak and asked Marek to join him for a winter ascent. It was a very ambitious idea, as there were no winter ascents of the peak at that time. It could have been a record, but neither Tomasz nor Marek had enough experience, equipment, or training for such a challenging expedition. Mountaineer Marek Klonowski recalls that Nanga Parbat attracted them for several reasons besides its fame and potential record. First, the mountain was relatively easy to get to, with the Diamir Wall only a 2-day hike away. Second, the climbing permit cost only $300. This was cheap compared to Everest permits, which cost tens of thousands of dollars, and an expedition rarely costs less than $50,000. Nanga Parbat offered a prestigious summit at an affordable price. However, climbers among themselves call it a killer mountain. Marek recalls back then, to save money on portas, we carried most of the things we would need on the mountain to base camp on our shoulders. We didn't have good gear. Our jackets, tents, and sleeping bags were the kind used by hikers, not winter expeditions to climb 8,000ers. We were so different from other expeditions that even the locals in the Pakistani village near the base camp couldn't believe we were going up the mountain. They failed to reach the summit then. The next year they returned with better equipment and a little more experience, and reached an elevation of 5,480 meters. But that was still a long way from 8,000 meters. Another year later, Tomasz reached an altitude of 7,315 meters on the Mazzino Ridge, but again he could not reach the summit. Having spent all the money for the expedition, they had to sell their equipment to buy tickets home. By 2015, Marek had decided to be done with the mountains, but Thomas wasn't about to give up. When Marek left, Thomas decided that he would climb alone and in the alpine style, fast, with minimal gear, without many camps, and most often without oxygen. This is a rather dangerous style of climbing that leaves no margin for error. Left alone, Thomas met climber Elisabeth Revol, a rising star on the French national climbing team. Elisabeth was 5 years younger than Thomas and his complete opposite. He was talkative, eccentric, a kind of anarchist, and she a quiet physical education teacher from a small town. He was a former drug addict. She avoided alcohol and gluten. But, as we know, opposites attract. Elisabeth did gymnastics as a child, and when she turned 19, her parents suggested she try rock climbing. In 2006, she joined a French expedition to the Bolivian Andes, from where she returned with 9 summits and 5 first descents, becoming a very promising climber. In 2008, she traveled to Pakistan, where she climbed 3 8,000ers broad peak, Gasherbrum 1 and Gasherbrum 2, without oxygen, and in just 16 days. In April 2009, Elisabeth set off for Annapurna with her Czech partner Martin Mnerik. They reached the east summit but were unable to climb the main peak due to hurricane force winds. On the descent, Martin went missing and his body has not yet been found. Elisabeth descended to base camp badly frostbitten and exhausted, and was given first aid and evacuated to a Kathmandu hospital. Her partner's death hit her hard and she gave up on the mountains for 4 years. In 2013, Elisabeth decided to return to the Himalayas and chose to climb Nanga Parbat. She didn't reach the summit that year, but returned 2 years later and teamed up with Thomas for a winter climbing attempt. She recalls, "I really enjoyed our climb together. We talked a lot and had a good time. That year we reached an altitude of 7,800 meters. They teamed up for another climbing attempt in the winter of 2016, but bad weather forced them to turn back down. It was Tomas's 6th attempt at a winter climb. Before leaving, he told a Polish journalist that it was his last attempt on Nanga Parbat and he would not return there again. On February 26, 2016, Simone Morrow, Alex Chicon and Mohammed Samir Ali became the first climbers to ascend Nanga Parbat in winter. The record that Thomas had dreamed of so much was missed. Thomas even tried to challenge their record, demanding more photos from the summit and navigators' data, but the record was counted, although Thomas never admitted it. Thomas told Elisabeth that he wanted to try to climb to the top again. He told her that he was bound to this mountain and had to end it once and for all, and that he was sure this attempt would be successful. They arrived at base camp on December 23, 2017. For Thomas, it was his 7th attempt at climbing, and for Elisabeth, it was his 4th. On January 21st, they rolled up camp before sunrise and headed for the summit. The ascent was slow, with only an hour of daylight left before sunset, and the climbers still had not reached the summit, but they were not going to turn back down. They had to finish what they had started. The shadows of the Himalayan peaks were growing longer, covering the surrounding valleys in darkness and making the air so cold that every breath became painful. Elisabeth Revol, a 38-year-old French climber with 4 8,000ers to her credit, took a few photos before the final push to the summit. For a second, the frame stopped on her partner, Thomas Makiewicz, who has been obsessed with Nanga Parbat for a decade. He had never attempted another 8,000-foot summit. He had stormed this particular peak again and again. On this day, Thomas was slower than usual. The footage shows that he was 100 meters down the slope, which is a huge distance for the mountains. Obviously, even then, he was already walking with his last strength. After taking a few shots, Elisabeth put the camera away, pulled out her navigator, and realized that she only had 100 meters vertical to go to become the first woman to climb Nanga Parbat in winter. The weather was calm, there was almost no wind, it was relatively warm for this altitude. But everything would change as soon as the sun went down, and the climbers were well aware of that. The wind would pick up and the temperature would drop to -50 degrees Celsius. They needed to be in a big hurry. She waited for Thomas and together they walked to the summit. Elisabeth would later tell a Polish TV channel that they reached the summit of 8,126 meters together at dusk that day. She became the first woman to make a winter ascent of Nanga Parbat, and Tomas became the first Polish climber, not as high profile but also a record. At the top they took a few pictures, but they had no time to enjoy the triumph. Besides, Tomas looked very tired. Elizabeth asked him how he was feeling and he said he couldn't see anything. Elizabeth knew that blindness was one of the symptoms of acute mountain sickness and that Tomas was probably suffering from brain swelling, which could be fatal if he was not immediately lowered down where he could get more oxygen. They climbed without oxygen tanks, alpine style. However, Tomas had spent all his strength on the ascent, and on the descent he was walking more and more slowly. Elizabeth put his hand on her shoulder and began to lower her blinded partner. When they reached an altitude of 7,895 meters, just below the so-called death zone, Tomas began having trouble breathing. When Elizabeth removed his mask, she saw scarlet blood flowing from his mouth. His nose and cheeks were white from frostbite. This bleeding was probably a sign of mountain sickness that had already caused his lungs to swell. Tomas had to be brought down immediately, so at 11 p.m. Elizabeth pulled out her satellite device and sent a text message to 3 people: her husband, Tomas's wife, and a friend, asking them to send helicopters to evacuate him. They continued to descend, but Tomas's pace was slowing, he was losing strength and growing weaker and weaker. Elizabeth realized that time was running out and every minute could be crucial. She did her best to support him and help him get down as low as possible. However, the situation was getting worse and Tomas was getting worse. Friends and relatives began searching for the helicopters in Pakistan. It was a difficult task as helicopters rarely fly above 6,000 meters and they were much higher. In the meantime, Elizabeth helped Tomas descend as low as possible to an altitude of 7,300 meters, where she dug a snow cave to shelter from the wind. From the cave, she sent another message. Tomas is in a terrible condition. He can't move on his own. We have no way to put up a tent. He needs to be evacuated urgently. Coincidentally, on a neighboring peak, a Polish expedition was attempting the winter first ascent of Mount K2, led by legendary Polish climber Krzysztof Wilecki. This 68-year-old mountaineer had in his asset all 14 8,000ers and single ascent without oxygen on Nanga Parbat in 1996. Krzysztof recalls these events as follows. I realized that the only option for Elizabeth and Tomas was to send a rescue team from us to Nanga Parbat and climb to help them. I asked the 13 climbers at K2 base camp if any of them would be willing to interrupt the climb to rescue 2 dying climbers, and every single one of them said yes. Wilecki chose Adam Bilicki, Denis Urubko, Pet Tamala and Yaroslav Bota for this rescue operation. However, the helicopters were badly delayed. Some say it was due to a cost dispute between the embassies of Poland, France, the Pakistani army and the insurance company. In the end, the climbers had to pay for the helicopters to the relatives of the victims. The helicopters arrived at the K2 base camp only at 1 o'clock on January 27th. Having taken 4 rescuers, they headed for Nanga Parbat. Finding the mountain and a place to land was not easy. The pilots had never been there, so when they got closer, Wilecki showed them where the village, base camp and possible landing site were. He also told the pilots that they looked like brave men and asked them to get the rescuers as high up the slope as possible if possible. The helicopters landed the rescuers at 4,800 meters, just below the first camp. It was not safe to fly further, so the climbers went on foot. The climbers decided that Tamala and Bota would stay at the landing site to prepare the camp, while Bilicki and Urubko would climb after the injured. Elizabeth stayed with Tomas in the snow cave, continuing to fight for his life. Tomas's condition was deteriorating and she realized that every minute counted. She did everything she could to support him and keep him alive until the rescue team arrived. They started their ascent at 17:30, and it must be said that they are some of the strongest climbers of our time. 34-year-old Adam Bilicki climbed Khan Tengri when he was only 17 years old, and on the account of 45-year-old Denis Urubko, 19 ascents of 8,000ers. The climbers were in a hurry and practically the whole route they went without insurance. During the whole ascent, they did not use a single ice drill. When they saw ropes, old ropes left by other expeditions, they used them, although it is also very dangerous because you never know how reliable this rope is. And I will remind you that this is a winter ascent to one of the most difficult 8,000ers, but apparently the climbers were very well prepared and most importantly acclimatized on K2, so they took a very fast pace. Belitsky and Urubko did not know where exactly Thomas and Elizabeth were, whether they stayed in the snow cave descending together or had already separated and were descending separately. This is how Denis Urubko recalls it. I started screaming in the hope that maybe some miracle had happened and they were here. I screamed and screamed through the wind. Finally, I heard someone's quiet voice. It was Elizabeth's. The climber had gotten frostbite and was suffering from mountain sickness, plus she was alone. Thomas was nowhere to be found. Before she was found by two Polish climbers, the woman was hallucinating. This is also a symptom of mountain sickness. Elizabeth thought someone had brought her tea, and the woman who showed up asked Elizabeth to give her boots in return. At that point, I automatically stood up, took off my shoes and gave them to her, and in the morning when I woke up I was only wearing socks, the climber recalls. The climbers gave the woman hot tea, tried to warm her frostbitten hands, and of course asked about Thomas. Elizabeth said that he could not move and walk on his own, so she was forced to leave him in the cave in their improvised camp. And then Urubko and Belitsky were faced with a very difficult choice: try to get to Thomas or bring Elizabeth down. And this is what Belitsky says: we realized that if we left Elizabeth and went after Thomas, she would die. Even if we get to Thomas and by some miracle he is alive, we can't get a man down from Nanga Parbat who can't walk on his own. The climbers make a very difficult decision. They will not go after Thomas, they will leave him to die in the mountains. At dawn, Belitsky, Urubko and Elizabeth start to descend. The woman had badly frostbitten hands and could hardly stand on her feet, so it is correct to say that she was started down. At 11:30, about 18 hours later, after arriving at Nanga Parbat, Belitsky and Urubko, along with the injured Elizabeth, reached the helicopters. One French politician asked President Emmanuel Macron to award the rescue team the Order of the Legion of Honor, France's highest civilian honor. But the rescuers refused, although they did accomplish a feat. This is what Adam Belitsky said about it: I think we did nothing extraordinary. Everyone would have done so in our place. To help others, it is the duty of every climber, the duty of every man. The climber Elizabeth Revol received serious frostbite but survived. Thomas Makiewicz was left with a wife and 3 children, and he remained forever on the slopes of Nanga Parbat, which he conquered. All that you think about this story, write in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you are not already subscribed. Tell your friends, I hope they will be interested too. See you at the new summit.